Picture this, a woman so captivating that a king literally broke England apart just to have her. Not metaphorically, literally. Henry VIII didn't just slide into Anne Boleyn's DMs. He rewrote the entire religious foundation of his kingdom, told the Pope to shove it, and sparked centuries of religious warfare, all because she wouldn't sleep with him unless he married her first. And here's the kicker, after all that world-shaking drama, after redefining Christianity itself, he had her beheaded 3 years later. Talk about buyer's remorse on a biblical scale. If you're ready to dive into history's most expensive breakup, one that literally cost a religion, then settle in. This story gets darker before it gets better. Let's start with what everyone gets wrong about Anne Boleyn. She wasn't some medieval Instagram influencer who accidentally seduced a king. She wasn't even supposed to be in the same room as royalty, let alone sharing a bed with it. Anne Boleyn was born into the kind of family that today we'd call upper middle class, with delusions of grandeur, wealthy enough to have opinions, not wealthy enough for those opinions to matter. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was basically the Tudor equivalent of a corporate climber who married the boss's daughter, except in this case, the boss's daughter was Elizabeth Howard, whose family tree read like a who's who of English nobility. Thomas wasn't nobility, he was what we generously call new money with ambitions. Think of him as that guy who buys a Tesla and suddenly starts lecturing everyone about environmental responsibility. Technically correct, but you know he's just showing off. The Boleyn family seat at Hever Castle wasn't exactly a shack, but it wasn't Versailles either. It was the kind of place where you could pretend to be important while still counting your coins. Thomas Boleyn was smart though, smart enough to know that in Tudor England, your daughters were your investment portfolio. You educated them, polished them, and then strategically deployed them at court, like well-dressed missiles, aimed at upward mobility. Anne was born sometime around 1501, though nobody bothered keeping precise records because, honestly, who cared? She was a girl, and not even a firstborn girl at that. She had an older sister, Mary, who everyone assumed would be the family's ticket to greatness. Mary was conventionally beautiful in that soft, agreeable way that men found non-threatening. Anne, on the other hand, was different. Here's where it gets interesting. Anne Boleyn wasn't beautiful by the standards of her time. She was tall when women were supposed to be petite. She was dark when fair complexions were fashionable. She had what contemporary accounts generously called a certain air, which is 16th century code for we can't figure out what it is about her, but something's definitely happening here. But here's what Thomas Boleyn understood that most parents didn't. Education was the ultimate cosmetic surgery. While other noble families were teaching their daughters to embroider and look decorative, Thomas was investing in Anne's mind. He sent her to the Low Countries, then to France, not for a gap year of self-discovery, but for a masterclass in sophistication. In France, Anne didn't just learn French. She absorbed French court culture like a sponge, soaking up luxury. She learned how to move through a room like she owned it, how to speak in ways that made people lean in to listen, how to be simultaneously available and untouchable. She watched French women wield influence through intelligence rather than just beauty, and she took notes. The French court was like finishing school for future femme fatales. While English court ladies were still basically decorative furniture with pulses, French women were playing chess with politics, religion and romance as their game pieces. Anne learned to read people like books, to spot weakness and leverage it, to make herself indispensable not through what she gave, but through what she withheld. When she returned to England around 1521, Anne Boleyn was no longer Thomas Boleyn's investment. She was a loaded weapon that nobody, including her family, quite knew how to handle. She had transformed from a provincial English girl into something that didn't quite fit any existing category. She wasn't just educated, she was intellectually dangerous. She wasn't just sophisticated, she was foreign enough to be exotic, but English enough to be attainable. The English court took one look at this transformed woman, and didn't know what to make of her. She dressed differently. French fashion was like wearing confidence as clothing. She spoke differently, mixing languages and references that showed off her education, without being obnoxious about it. She moved differently, with a kind of self-possession that suggested she knew secrets nobody else did. Most importantly, she acted differently around men. While other court ladies giggled and blushed and played the demure maiden routine, Anne treated men like intellectual equals who happened to be useful for conversation. She debated theology, discussed politics, and made it clear that her mind was not for decoration. In a world where women were expected to be seen and not heard, Anne Boleyn was determined to be both seen and remembered. But here's the thing about being memorable in a royal court. It's a double-edged sword that can cut you on the way up or the way down. Anne had transformed herself into exactly the kind of woman who could catch a king's attention. She just hadn't considered what would happen if she actually succeeded. The stage was set, the players were in position, and somewhere in the royal apartments, Henry VIII was about to meet the one woman who would refuse to be just another conquest. Neither of them knew it yet, but their first conversation would set in motion events that would reshape English religion, politics, and history itself. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who aren't supposed to matter at all. Let's talk about Henry VIII for a moment, because understanding Anne Boleyn's story means understanding exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. Picture your most entitled ex-boyfriend, multiply that by absolute monarchy, add a crown and the legal right to execute people who annoy you, and you're getting close to Henry circa. Henry wasn't born to be king. He was the spare, the insurance policy, the just-in-case heir. His older brother Arthur was supposed to inherit the throne, marry Catherine of Aragon, and live happily ever after, while Henry became a duke with a nice pension and zero responsibilities. But Arthur died, as inconvenient elder brothers sometimes do, and suddenly Henry went from spare heir to heir apparent faster than you can say dynastic crisis. This shift from backup to main character fundamentally broke something in Henry's psyche. He'd spent his childhood preparing to be decoratively royal, good at sports, charming at parties, impressive enough to reflect well on the family, but not actually responsible for running anything important. Then boom, suddenly he's responsible for an entire kingdom, and nobody bothered to update his emotional operating system for the job. By the time Anne Boleyn strutted back from France with her continental education and her refusal to be impressed by titles, Henry had been king for 16 years. 16 years of everyone telling him he was God's chosen representative on earth. 16 years of nobody being allowed to tell him no about anything, ever. 16 years of collecting mistresses like other people collect stamps enthusiastically, temporarily, and with the assumption that there would always be more available. Henry's approach to women was basically royal Pokemon. Gotta catch 'em all, display the rarest ones prominently, and trade them in when you get bored. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had settled into the comfortable routine of a business partnership. Catherine was Spanish royalty, which was politically useful, and she'd produced one surviving child, unfortunately, a daughter named Mary, which in Henry's mind didn't count as a proper heir. But here's where Henry's psychology gets really messy. He wasn't just collecting women for pleasure, he was collecting them for validation. Each conquest proved he was still the most desirable man in England. Each affair confirmed that being king made him irresistible. Each mistress was basically a mirror, reflecting back his own magnificence. His most recent affair had been with Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister, the pretty, agreeable one who knew her place and didn't ask complicated questions. Mary had been perfect mistress material, beautiful enough to be a trophy, discreet enough to avoid scandal, and grateful enough to accept whatever Henry offered, without negotiating for more. She'd even produced a son, though Henry would never officially acknowledge the boy. Mary understood the rules of royal affairs. Take what's offered, don't ask for more, and disappear gracefully when your time is up. This system worked beautifully for Henry because it fed his ego, without threatening his control. Kings throughout history had operated this way. Wives for politics, mistresses for pleasure, and clear boundaries between the two categories. It was a sustainable system that kept everyone in their designated roles. But here's what Henry didn't understand about the Boleyn family dynamics. Mary might have been the pretty one, but Anne was the smart one, and while Mary had been content to play by the established rules, Anne had spent years in France learning that rules were just suggestions made by people who lacked imagination. Henry first encountered Anne around 5025, when she returned from France, and joined the court as one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. It was supposed to be a routine appointment. Thomas Boleyn cashing in political favours to position his daughter advantageously. Anne was meant to serve the Queen, marry well eventually, and provide her family with useful connections, standard operating procedure for ambitious noble families. What nobody anticipated was the chemical reaction that would occur when Henry's supreme confidence met Anne's supreme indifference to his supremacy. Think about it from Henry's perspective. He was used to women who lit up like Christmas trees when he paid them attention. Mary had been appropriately dazzled by royal interest. Catherine treated him with respectful devotion. Every other woman at court either flirted desperately for his attention, or cowered appropriately in his presence. Then along comes Anne Boleyn, who looked at the King of England like he was mildly interesting wallpaper. She was polite. Certainly she wasn't suicidal, but she wasn't impressed. She didn't giggle at his jokes unless they were actually funny. She didn't hang on his every word unless he was saying something worth hearing. She treated him like a person rather than a position, which was simultaneously refreshing and absolutely infuriating. For a man whose entire sense of self-worth depended on being the most important person in every room, Anne's casual indifference was like catnip. She represented the one thing Henry had never successfully conquered, a woman who didn't want to be conquered by him. The irony is delicious. Henry VIII, who could have any woman in England just by pointing at her, became obsessed with the one woman who acted like being chosen by him wasn't the ultimate prize. Anne had accidentally stumbled onto the most effective seduction strategy in human history. She made herself valuable by being unavailable. But this wasn't a strategy, this was just who Anne was. She'd been educated to believe in her own worth, trained to expect intellectual partnership, and conditioned to think that marriage should be about more than just political convenience and reproductive duty. She wasn't playing hard to get. She genuinely didn't understand why she should be impressed by a man just because he happened to be king. Two incompatible worldviews were about to collide with the force of tectonic plates shifting, and somewhere in the distance, the Pope was about to have a very bad century. Here's where Anne Boleyn's story transforms from palace gossip into world-changing catastrophe, because what started as Henry's standard royal crush was about to spiral into the kind of international incident that makes historians write entire libraries trying to explain what the hell happened. The courtship began innocently enough. If you consider a married king aggressively pursuing his wife's lady-in-waiting innocent, Henry started with his usual playbook: expensive gifts, flowery poetry, and the kind of attention that was supposed to make any reasonable woman melt like chocolate in July. He sent Anne jewelry that cost more than most people's houses. He wrote her love letters that read like a teenager's diary entries. "All you are the most beautiful woman in the world, and I would die without your love." Anne's response? Basically the 16th century equivalent of thanks but no thanks. Now, let's pause here and appreciate the absolutely nuclear level audacity this required. This wasn't just turning down the most powerful man in England. This was turning down a king who had recently executed people for much smaller slights to his ego. Anne was essentially playing chicken with an absolute monarch who had a documented history of solving problems with execution as axes. But Anne had learned something in France that the other English court ladies hadn't: the difference between being desired and being valued. Henry's previous mistresses had accepted being desired as enough. They got beautiful gifts, temporary influence, and the social status that came with royal attention. But desire fades. Desire gets bored. Desire moves on to fresher entertainment. Anne wanted to be valued, and she understood with an intuition that would have impressed modern relationship therapists that you can't be truly valued by someone who gets everything they want just by wanting it. So she implemented what might be history's most successful long-term negotiation strategy. She accepted Henry's gifts, but not his advances. She enjoyed his attention, but didn't reward it with intimacy. She made herself pleasant company without making herself available for conquest. She was warm enough to keep him interested, but cool enough to keep him frustrated. Henry, meanwhile, was experiencing something completely foreign to his psychology: genuine romantic rejection. Not the polite deferrals that married women gave to preserve appearances. Not the strategic delays that ambitious families used to negotiate better terms. Actual, personal rejection from a woman who seemed to find him nice but not particularly special. This drove Henry absolutely insane in the best and worst possible ways. The king who collected women like rare books suddenly encountered a book that wouldn't let itself be collected. The man who'd never heard no from anyone who wasn't actively trying to start a war was hearing no from a woman who seemed perfectly happy to remain friends instead. Anne's rejection wasn't angry or fearful. It was cheerful, almost casual, which made it infinitely more devastating. She treated Henry's romantic overtures like polite social pleasantries, rather than earth-shaking declarations of royal desire. She was essentially patting the King of England on the head and saying, "That's nice, dear." The psychological effect on Henry was catastrophic. Every rejected advance made Anne more valuable in his mind. Every pleasant but non-romantic conversation made him more desperate to prove his worth to her. Every time she smiled at another courtier or seemed content without his attention, Henry's obsession deepened into something that was part genuine love, part wounded pride, and part megalomaniacal fury. But here's where Anne revealed the full scope of her strategic genius. When Henry finally escalated from "please be my mistress" to "I need to have you," Anne didn't just say no. She said, "not unless you marry me." Let that sink in for a moment. Anne Boleyn looked at the King of England and essentially said, "Your current offer is insufficient. Please revise your proposal and try again." This wasn't just audacity, this was diplomatic revolution disguised as romantic negotiation. Anne was demanding that Henry treat her, not as a temporary entertainment, but as a permanent partner. Not as a mistress to be hidden away, but as a wife to be honored publicly. Not as a political convenience, but as a person worthy of his most sacred commitment. Henry's response reveals everything you need to know about his psychological state by this point. A rational king would have said, "Well, that's unfortunate, but I'm already married, so let's part as friends." A practical king would have found another mistress and moved on with his life. Instead, Henry decided to divorce his wife of 20 years, break England away from the Roman Catholic Church, declare himself the head of his own new religion, and risk war with the most powerful empires in Europe, all because Anne Boleyn wouldn't sleep with him unless he married her first. Think about this in modern terms. Imagine if someone liked you so much they were willing to quit their religion, alienate their family, risk their career, and potentially start a civil war rather than accept that you weren't interested in a casual relationship. We'd call that stalking and recommend a restraining order. But Henry wasn't just anyone. He was a king with the power to reshape reality to match his desires. If the Catholic Church wouldn't grant him a divorce, he'd create his own church that would. If Parliament objected, he'd intimidate them into compliance. If other European powers threatened war, he'd call their bluff and prepare for battle. Anne had accidentally discovered that there was literally no limit to what Henry VIII would do to possess something he couldn't have. She turned a simple romantic rejection into the catalyst for one of history's most dramatic religious and political transformations. The woman who wasn't supposed to matter had just become the reason Christianity split in half, and she still hadn't said yes. By 1527, Anne Boleyn's refusal to become Henry's mistress had evolved from personal drama into international incident. What started as one woman's romantic standards was now threatening to tear apart the careful political balance that had kept Europe from complete chaos. Here's the situation Henry faced, and it's absolutely bonkers when you really think about it. He was the King of England, theoretically one of the most powerful men on earth, but he couldn't get a divorce because a guy in Rome who'd never met his wife said marriage was permanent. The Pope's authority over Christian marriage meant that Henry's personal happiness was subject to Vatican approval, and the Vatican was saying no. Pope Clement VII wasn't being arbitrary about this. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who basically controlled most of Europe, and had recently sacked Rome just to make his point about papal cooperation. Telling Charles V that his aunt's marriage was invalid wasn't just diplomatically awkward, it was the kind of decision that got popes killed and cities burned. So there was Henry, trapped between his obsession with Anne and the political reality that his marriage was locked in place by forces beyond even royal power. Any normal person would have accepted this as fate and found a different obsession. Henry decided to invent his own religion instead. The English Reformation wasn't some gradual theological evolution or philosophical awakening about religious truth. It was a bureaucratic solution to a romantic problem. Henry literally researched obscure biblical passages until he found verses that could be interpreted as suggesting that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she'd previously been married to his dead brother. This was the Tudor equivalent of Googling how to get divorced when your wife won't sign the papers, and deciding the entire legal system needed to be overthrown because it wouldn't give you what you wanted. Anne, meanwhile, was navigating an increasingly impossible situation. She'd said she wouldn't sleep with Henry unless he married her, but now Henry was trying to restructure English Christianity to make that marriage possible. This was either the most romantic gesture in human history, or the most terrifying display of obsessive behavior ever recorded, possibly both. The psychological pressure on Anne during this period must have been extraordinary. She'd gone from being a minor court lady to being the reason England might break with Rome. Every conversation with Henry was potentially treason, not because of what she said, but but because of how he interpreted it. Every smile from her was seen as encouragement for his increasingly radical plans. Every moment of doubt or hesitation was viewed as betrayal by a man who was reshaping his kingdom to suit her preferences. And here's the really twisted part. Anne was starting to realize that she couldn't back down even if she wanted to. Too many people now had too much invested in Henry's divorce for her to simply disappear gracefully. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, was building his entire political career on making the king's marriage to Anne happen. The emerging Protestant faction at court saw Anne as their ticket to religious reform. Even Anne's own family had bet everything on her eventually becoming queen. Anne Boleyn had become trapped by her own success. She'd refused to be Henry's mistress, and now she couldn't refuse to be his potential wife without destroying everyone who'd supported their relationship. But let's talk about what Anne was actually doing during this impossible waiting period, because it reveals the full scope of her intelligence and ambition. She wasn't just sitting around waiting for Henry to solve their problem. She was muzzling herself to be worthy of the crown he was promising her. Anne began studying theology, not as a hobby but as preparation for potentially becoming queen of a newly Protestant England. She read reformist texts that were technically illegal, discussed religious philosophy with scholars who were risking their lives to challenge Catholic doctrine, and developed genuine expertise in the theological questions that would soon reshape English Christianity. This wasn't just political calculation. Anne appears to have experienced genuine religious conviction about Protestant reform. She believed that the Catholic Church had become corrupt, that individuals should have direct relationships with God without priestly intermediaries, and that the Bible should be available in English so ordinary people could read it themselves. In other words, while Henry was breaking with Rome to satisfy his personal desires, Anne was preparing to break with Rome for ideological reasons. She wasn't just going to be queen, she was going to be a reformist queen who used her position to advance Protestant theology throughout England. The irony is beautiful in its complexity. Henry thought he was reshaping English religion to possess Anne Boleyn. Anne was preparing to use Henry's obsession with her to reshape English religion according to her own convictions. Both of them believed they were manipulating the other, and both of them were probably right. By 1533, after 6 years of international drama, parliamentary manoeuvring, and religious revolution, Henry had finally arranged his divorce from Catherine and his marriage to Anne. England was officially Protestant. The Pope had excommunicated Henry, half of Europe was threatening war, and several prominent English nobles had been executed for opposing the king's new marriage. Anne Boleyn was finally queen. She'd gotten everything she'd demanded, and more. Henry had literally moved heaven and earth to make her his wife. But here's the thing about getting everything you think you want. Sometimes you realize you've been asking for the wrong things, and sometimes the person who's willing to destroy everything to possess you turns out to be the kind of person who's willing to destroy everything to possess you. Anne was about to discover that marrying a man who'd broken his kingdom apart, to have her came with certain expectations she hadn't fully considered. June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was finally crowned Queen of England in a ceremony so lavish it probably cost more than most countries' annual budgets. Golden cloth, precious jewels, elaborate pageantry. Henry spared no expense in showing the world that his new wife was worth every bit of political chaos he'd created to marry her. But if you were paying attention to the crowd during Anne's coronation procession through London, you might have noticed something troubling. The cheers were polite, but not enthusiastic. People bowed because they had to, not because they wanted to. The famous English crowds that had roared their approval for previous royal ceremonies were remarkably quiet. Anne had become queen, but she'd also become the human embodiment of religious revolution that half the country didn't want. To English Catholics, she wasn't Queen Anne. She was that woman who'd seduced their king into abandoning the true faith. To supporters of Catherine of Aragon, she wasn't a legitimate queen, but a homewrecker who'd destroyed a 20-year marriage. To political conservatives, she represented dangerous change that threatened English stability. Anne had won the ultimate prize. But the prize came with enemies she'd never anticipated, and responsibilities she'd never fully understood. Being queen wasn't just about wearing a crown and being married to the king. It was about representing the monarchy to people who increasingly saw that monarchy as illegitimate. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the growing pressure in Anne's belly. She was pregnant during her coronation, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a calculated political move to ensure that Anne's child would be born legitimate. Henry had timed the ceremony perfectly to maximize the chances that his new wife would produce the male heir that Catherine had failed to provide. The pregnancy added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Anne wasn't just responsible for being a good queen, she was responsible for producing the future King of England. Her body had become a matter of national security. Every day of her pregnancy was monitored, analyzed, and discussed by courtiers, who treated her reproductive system like a political weather report. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth. The court physicians had predicted a son based on the shape of her belly, the way she carried the pregnancy, and probably some medieval equivalent of reading tea leaves. Henry had already planned celebrations for the birth of Prince Edward, the future King Edward IX. Anne delivered a healthy baby girl. The silence in the birthing chamber must have been deafening. This wasn't just medical disappointment, this was political catastrophe. Henry had risked everything, literally everything, to marry Anne and secure his dynasty. He'd broken with Rome, divorced his first wife, executed nobles who opposed him, and spent 6 years in international crisis to produce another daughter. The baby was named Elizabeth, and while she would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs, in 1533 she represented Henry's worst nightmare, proof that God was still angry with him, despite all his religious reforms. Here's where Anne's situation becomes truly heartbreaking. She delivered exactly what any reasonable person would consider a successful birth. A healthy child born to parents who wanted her. But Anne wasn't evaluated by reasonable standards. She was evaluated by the impossible standard of producing male heirs on command. And she'd already failed her first test as queen. Henry's reaction reveals everything about his character, and nothing good about his capacity for rational thought. Instead of celebrating his daughter's health, or acknowledging that gender determination is entirely dependent on male genetics, Henry decided this was somehow Anne's fault. The king who'd moved heaven and earth to marry her was now disappointed that she couldn't control biological processes that wouldn't be understood for another 4 centuries. But Anne, to her credit, didn't crumble under this impossible pressure. She threw herself into being the kind of queen she'd always intended to be. Intelligent, politically engaged, and genuinely committed to Protestant reform. She used her position to advance religious changes that would outlast both her and Henry. She patronized scholars, supported the translation of the Bible into English, and worked to establish educational reforms that would benefit ordinary English citizens. Anne also proved to be surprisingly effective at the political aspects of queenship. She understood court dynamics, managed complex relationships with foreign ambassadors, and demonstrated the kind of diplomatic skill that comes from years of navigating French court politics. She wasn't just decorative royalty, she was functional royalty who took her responsibilities seriously. But here's the cruel irony of Anne's position. Every success she achieved as queen made Henry more suspicious of her independence, and every failure was blamed on her inadequacy rather than on circumstances beyond her control. When Anne expressed opinions about policy, Henry saw it as inappropriate interference. When she remained silent, he accused her of not caring about his kingdom. When she was friendly with courtiers, Henry suspected her of flirtation. When she was formal and distant, he accused her of being cold and ungrateful. Anne had married a man who'd proven he would destroy anything that stood between him and what he wanted. Now she was discovering that this included destroying the thing he'd wanted once he actually possessed it. The psychological dynamic was becoming clear. Henry hadn't married Anne because he loved her. He'd married her because she was the one thing he couldn't have. Now that he had her, the obsession that had driven him to reshape English Christianity was starting to curdle into resentment. Anne was learning the hardest lesson about getting everything you think you want. Sometimes the person willing to give you everything is the same person willing to take it all away when you fail to live up to their impossible expectations. And she was about to discover just how impossible those expectations really were. Let's talk about what it was like to be married to Henry VIII once the honeymoon period ended. Because Anne's experience reveals marriage dynamics that would make modern relationship counselors reach for their strongest antidepressants. By 1534, barely a year into their marriage, Henry had transformed from obsessive suitor into demanding husband with a speed that would have impressed NASCAR drivers. The man who'd spent 6 years writing love letters about how Anne was perfect in every way was now keeping a mental scorecard of her imperfections with the dedication of an accountant during tax season. Henry's expectations for Anne weren't just high, they were physically impossible. She was supposed to be a devoted wife who hung on his every word, but also an intelligent partner who could discuss theology and politics. A modest queen who deferred to his judgment, but also a charismatic leader who could win over his suspicious subjects. A passionate lover who desired only him, but also a pure and virtuous woman who never displayed inappropriate emotion. A fertile mother who produced male heirs on schedule, but also a youthful beauty who never showed the physical effects of pregnancy and childbirth. In other words, Henry wanted Anne to be a perfect medieval wife, and a perfect Renaissance woman, and a perfect political partner, and a perfect sexual fantasy, all simultaneously, without ever acknowledging that these roles contradicted each other. Anne, meanwhile, was trying to navigate being queen while dealing with the reality that her husband's attention span had the staying power of a goldfish on espresso. The same man who'd once written her 17-page love letters now got visibly bored if she spoke for more than 5 minutes about anything that wasn't directly related to his immediate interests. But here's where Anne's French education served her well. She'd learned to recognize when men were testing her, rather than actually listening to her. Henry wasn't just being a difficult husband. He was actively looking for reasons to be dissatisfied with her. Every conversation was an audition for a role she'd already been cast in, and the reviews were getting harsher with each performance. The pressure was extraordinary, but Anne had resources that Henry's previous wives hadn't possessed. She was genuinely intelligent, she understood court politics, and she had her own network of supporters who valued her for reasons beyond her marriage to the king. Anne began building what we'd now recognize as an independent power base, relationships and alliances that existed because of who she was rather than whom she'd married. This drove Henry absolutely insane. Remember, Henry had spent 6 years proving that he could remake his entire kingdom to possess Anne Boleyn. Now he was discovering that possessing her didn't mean controlling her, and the gap between those two concepts was driving him to increasingly erratic behavior. When Anne expressed opinions about religious reform, Henry accused her of being too radical. When she supported moderate positions, he accused her of being insufficiently committed to the Protestant cause they'd both risked everything to advance. When she was friendly with reformist scholars, Henry worried she was plotting against him. When she avoided controversial figures, Henry decided she was politically naive. Anne couldn't win, and she was starting to realize that winning wasn't actually the point. Henry wasn't evaluating her performance as queen. He was managing his own psychological disappointment at discovering that marriage to Anne Boleyn hadn't magically solved all his problems. Think about it from Henry's twisted perspective. He'd convinced himself that all his difficulties, his lack of male heirs, his conflicts with European powers, his domestic opposition existed because he wasn't married to the right woman. Anne was supposed to be the solution that made everything else fall into place. Instead, marrying Anne had created new problems without solving the old ones. England was still isolated from Catholic Europe. The succession was still uncertain. Political opposition had simply shifted rather than disappeared. And now Henry had a wife who had her own opinions about how these problems should be addressed. But Anne was also dealing with a more immediate crisis. She was failing at the one job that really mattered to Henry. Despite multiple pregnancies, she hadn't produced the male heir that had justified their entire relationship. Each miscarriage was treated not as a medical tragedy, but as a personal failure that reflected on her adequacy as queen. The psychological toll of repeated pregnancy losses under such scrutiny would have broken most people. Anne was grieving the children she'd lost while being blamed for their deaths by a husband who saw her body as a political instrument that was malfunctioning. And yet, through all of this, Anne continued to be an effective queen in ways that Henry either couldn't see or chose not to acknowledge. She was advancing Protestant reform with a sophistication that impressed foreign observers. She was managing court relationships with a skill that had taken her years to develop. She was representing English interests in diplomatic conversations with a competence that her predecessor Catherine had never matched. But Henry wasn't measuring Anne against the standard of effective queenship. He was measuring her against the impossible fantasy he'd created during their 6-year courtship. Real Anne, with her human limitations and independent thoughts and biological realities, could never compete with fantasy Anne, who had existed only in Henry's imagination. The gap between Henry's expectations and Anne's reality was widening into a chasm that would eventually swallow their marriage whole. And somewhere in the background, a new face was appearing at court. A young woman named Jane Seymour who seemed refreshingly simple after years of Anne's complexity. Henry was about to make the same mistake again, but this time he had the legal framework to solve his romantic problems with considerably more permanent solutions. Enter Jane Seymour, stage right, looking like everything Anne Boleyn wasn't, which was exactly what made her irresistible to a king who was discovering that getting everything he'd wanted hadn't actually made him happy. Jane was the anti-Anne in every way that mattered to Henry's increasingly unstable psychology. Where Anne was dark, Jane was fair. Where Anne was intellectually challenging, Jane was pleasantly agreeable. Where Anne had opinions about theology and politics, Jane had the good sense to keep her thoughts to herself. Where Anne had demanded marriage before intimacy, Jane seemed perfectly content to let Henry set the terms of their relationship. But here's the delicious irony that everyone missed at the time. Jane Seymour was basically playing Anne Boleyn's original strategy, just with better timing and worse luck in choosing which king to employ it on. Jane was modest and retiring, but not because she lacked ambition, because she'd watched Anne's career carefully and learned that direct confrontation with Henry VIII was a losing strategy. She was sexually unavailable, but not because she was making some principled stand about marriage, because she'd seen what happened to women who gave Henry everything he wanted too quickly. In other words, Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn 2.0, an upgraded version that had learned from the original's user experience and corrected for the bugs that had eventually crashed the system. The tragedy is that Anne probably could have seen this coming if she hadn't been so exhausted from 3 years of trying to be the perfect queen for an imperfect king. But by 1535, Anne was running on fumes. The constant pressure to produce male heirs, the impossible balance between being influential and being submissive, the never-ending performance of being grateful for a crown that came with increasingly obvious strings attached. It was all taking its toll. Anne was becoming what we'd now recognize as burned out. She was snapping at servants, arguing with Henry more publicly, and generally displaying the kind of human frailty that absolute monarchs find extremely unattractive in their wives. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour was floating through court like a gentle breeze, pleasant and undemanding and refreshingly drama-free after years of Anne's intensity. She didn't challenge Henry's opinions or expect him to remember their conversations or make him feel like he had to prove his intelligence to keep up with hers. Henry was discovering the intoxicating appeal of a woman who made him feel smart and important and effortlessly superior, rather than constantly challenged to be better than he actually was. But let's pause here and acknowledge something crucial. Anne Boleyn wasn't failing as a queen or as a wife by any reasonable standard. She was simply failing to be superhuman, which was the only standard Henry was willing to accept from the woman he'd restructured Christianity to marry. Anne had successfully advanced Protestant reform beyond anything Henry had originally intended. She'd managed complex diplomatic relationships with skill that impressed foreign ambassadors. She'd supported educational and social reforms that would benefit England long after she was gone. She'd even produced a daughter who would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. But none of that mattered to Henry, because Anne had also done something unforgivable. She'd revealed herself to be a real person with human limitations, rather than the fantasy projection he'd been in love with for 6 years. The psychological dynamic at work here would be familiar to anyone who's ever experienced the end of an obsessive relationship. Henry had been in love with the idea of Anne Boleyn, the unattainable woman who would solve all his problems once he possessed her. Actually being married to the real Anne Boleyn, with her own needs and opinions and occasional bad moods, was destroying the fantasy that had justified all his sacrifices. Jane Seymour represented the opportunity to start over with a clean slate. She was new enough to be mysterious, simple enough to be manageable, and smart enough to avoid Anne's mistakes, without being threatening in her own intelligence. From Jane's perspective, the calculation was probably straightforward. Anne had proven that it was possible for a non-royal woman to become Queen of England. She'd also proven that being Queen of England was a temporary position with significant occupational hazards. Jane could either avoid those hazards by being a different kind of queen, or she could accept them as the price of wearing a crown. But here's what's truly disturbing about the Jane Seymour situation. Henry wasn't just losing interest in Anne, he was actively rewriting their history to justify his desire for someone new. The same man who'd claimed that God wanted him to marry Anne was now suggesting that God might have been mistaken about that. The same king who'd argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because it displeased heaven was now wondering if his marriage to Anne might be similarly problematic. Anne was watching her husband perform the exact same psychological gymnastics that had destroyed his first wife, and she was smart enough to recognize the pattern. Henry didn't divorce wives, he invalidated marriages. He didn't admit to making mistakes, He discovered that his previous decisions had been based on insufficient information or divine miscommunication. The man who'd moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn was preparing to move them again to get rid of her, and this time he had the legal and religious framework to make his romantic problems disappear much more efficiently than he'd managed with Catherine of Aragon. Anne was about to discover that there are worse things than not getting what you want. Sometimes getting exactly what you asked for puts you in a position where someone else gets to decide whether you deserve to keep it. By early 1536, Anne Boleyn was living in a psychological horror movie where everyone was smiling and the background music was getting increasingly ominous. She could see the signs: Henry's attention drifting, Jane Seymour's strategic positioning, her own supporters beginning to distance themselves, but she couldn't acknowledge the reality without seeming paranoid or desperate. This is where Anne's intelligence became both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. She was smart enough to recognize that Henry was following the exact same pattern he'd used to dispose of Catherine of Aragon. But she was also smart enough to know that pointing this out would only accelerate the process. Anne was trapped in what psychologists call a double bind. Any reaction that acknowledged her precarious position would be seen as proof that she was unsuitable for that position. If she fought to maintain Henry's interest, she was being aggressive and unfeminine. If she accepted his distance gracefully, she was admitting that their relationship didn't matter to her. But let's talk about what was really happening here. Because the Anne Boleyn story is often presented as a simple case of a king getting bored with his wife, the reality was much more complex and considerably more terrifying. Henry wasn't just losing interest in Anne, he was systematically constructing a case for why their marriage had been a mistake from the beginning. This wasn't casual marital dissatisfaction. This was strategic historical revision designed to justify whatever solution Henry was planning to implement. The same theological arguments Henry had used to invalidate his marriage to Catherine were now being quietly researched and refined to apply to his marriage to Anne. The same biblical scholars who'd found divine justification for Protestant reform were now being asked to reconsider whether God had actually intended for Henry to marry his second wife. Anne was watching her husband's lawyers and theologians slowly build the legal framework for erasing their relationship from history. Every day brought new discoveries about potential problems with their marriage ceremony, new interpretations of scripture that suggested divine disapproval, new concerns about whether Anne's previous engagement to Henry Percy might have invalidated her subsequent marriage to the king. This was gaslighting on an institutional level. Henry wasn't just questioning Anne's suitability as queen, he was questioning whether she'd ever been queen at all. The same marriage that had justified breaking England away from Rome was now being examined for flaws that would justify breaking Henry away from Anne. Meanwhile, Anne was still trying to fulfill her primary responsibility as queen, producing male heirs. She became pregnant again in late 1535, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a son might solve all their problems. Henry's attention returned. Jane Seymour faded into the background, and the court buzzed with excitement about the potential future King Edward IX. Then Anne miscarried, and Henry's disappointment curdled into something much darker than mere frustration. Here's where Henry's psychology reveals its truly dangerous depths. He didn't just blame Anne for the miscarriage. He decided the miscarriage was proof that God disapproved of their marriage. The same divine authority Henry had claimed supported his divorce from Catherine was now being invoked to suggest that his marriage to Anne was similarly cursed. The speed of Henry's transformation from disappointed husband to actively hostile adversary was breathtaking. Within weeks of Anne's miscarriage, she went from being the beloved queen whose pregnancy was a matter of national celebration to being a suspicious figure whose continued presence might be angering God. But Henry still had a problem. Unlike his divorce from Catherine, which had taken 6 years of careful legal maneuvering, his desire to be rid of Anne required a solution that could be implemented quickly and permanently. Jane Seymour wasn't going to wait around while Henry spent another decade negotiating with theologians. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Henry's solution to his Anne Boleyn problem wasn't going to be another divorce. It was going to be something much more final and much more terrifying. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest and treason. The charges were so obviously fabricated that even Henry's own courtiers were stunned by their audacity. Anne was accused of having affairs with multiple men, including her own brother, and of plotting to kill the king so she could marry her lovers. The evidence for these charges was so thin, it was practically transparent. The supposed affairs had allegedly taken place at times and locations where Anne could be proven to have been elsewhere. The men accused of being her lovers had alibis that were corroborated by dozens of witnesses. The entire case read like a legal document written by someone who wasn't particularly concerned about whether anyone would believe it. But that's because belief wasn't the point. Henry didn't need to convince anyone that Anne was actually guilty. He just needed to create enough legal justification to execute her without seeming like a complete tyrant. The charges were theatrical rather than factual, designed to provide moral cover for a decision that Henry had already made for entirely different reasons. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had refused to become Henry's mistress unless he married her first, was about to be executed for allegedly being too willing to become everyone else's mistress after he had married her. The irony was brutal, the logic was non-existent, and the outcome was inevitable. Henry VIII had found his final solution to the Anne Boleyn problem, and it didn't require theological debates or parliamentary approval or international diplomacy. It just required an executioner's sword and a king who had convinced himself that murder was actually justice. The trial of Anne Boleyn was less a legal proceeding and more a macabre theatre performance where everyone knew the ending before the curtain went up. But let's examine this travesty of justice in detail, because it reveals everything about how power operates when it's completely unconstrained by law, morality, or basic human decency. Anne was charged with adultery with 5 different men: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and her own brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The adultery charges were serious enough. Adultery by a queen was considered treason punishable by death, but the incest charge elevated the accusations into something so shocking that even hardened courtiers were scandalized. Let's look at the evidence against Anne, and by evidence I mean the collection of coincidences, misinterpretations, and outright fabrications that Henry's investigators cobbled together when they were told to find something, anything, that would justify execution. The case against Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was based entirely on his confession under torture. Smeaton was the only one of the accused men who wasn't noble, which meant he could be legally tortured until he said whatever his interrogators wanted to hear. Unsurprisingly, after sufficient encouragement from professional torturers, Smeaton confessed to having an affair with the Queen. The cases against the other men were even flimsier. Henry Norris was accused because Anne had supposedly said to him, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me," which was interpreted as evidence that they were plotting Henry's death so they could marry. This is roughly equivalent to convicting someone of murder because they said, "I could just kill my boss after a particularly frustrating meeting." William Brereton's crime was apparently being in the same room as Anne on several occasions, and once helping her with a financial matter. Francis Weston was accused because he'd allegedly said he loved Anne more than his own wife, which, even if true, was the sort of courtly romance language that every nobleman used when speaking to queens. It was basically medieval small talk, not evidence of adultery. The charge against George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was the most desperate of all. The prosecution claimed that Anne had told George that Henry was not skilled in bed, and somehow this private conversation between siblings was twisted into evidence of incestuous conspiracy. The logic was so convoluted that even the prosecutors seemed embarrassed presenting it. But here's what made the trial truly Kafkaesque. Anne wasn't allowed to present evidence in her own defense beyond her own testimony. She couldn't call witnesses who would contradict the charges. She couldn't produce the court records that would prove she was elsewhere when these alleged affairs supposedly took place. She couldn't even point out that the timeline of accusations made no sense because the men were supposedly having affairs with her at times when several of them were provably in different countries. Anne's defense was essentially limited to saying, "I didn't do this," while her accusers got to say yes she did, and have their version accepted as fact. The trial was held on May 15, 1536, in the Tower of London, which should tell you everything about how fair and impartial the proceedings were expected to be. Anne was judged by a jury of her peers, 26 noblemen who knew perfectly well that Henry wanted a guilty verdict, and that their own futures depended on giving him what he wanted. Anne's performance during the trial was extraordinary. She maintained her innocence with a dignity and composure that impressed even her enemies. She answered every accusation calmly and logically, pointing out the inconsistencies in the charges and the impossibility of the timeline the prosecution had constructed. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Anne addressed the court directly. She said, "I am clear from the company of man. As for my brother and those others who are unjustly condemned, I would willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them." Think about that for a moment. Anne Boleyn, facing execution on fabricated charges, used her final statement not to beg for her own life, but to protest the injustice being done to the innocent men who were going to die because of their association with her. The verdict was announced before Anne had finished speaking. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death, either by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, pronounced the sentence with tears in his eyes, though whether those tears were from genuine emotion or from fear of what would happen to him if he showed insufficient enthusiasm for the king's justice remains unclear. Anne's response to her death sentence was remarkable. "O Father, O Creator, thou dost know that I have not deserved this death." 26 noblemen had just convicted the Queen of England of crimes that everyone in that room knew she hadn't committed. They'd sentenced her to death based on evidence that wouldn't have convinced a medieval peasant jury. They'd participated in what was essentially state-sponsored murder, disguised as legal procedure. And they'd done it all because their king wanted to marry someone else, and couldn't think of a more convenient way to dispose of his current wife. The trial of Anne Boleyn wasn't a miscarriage of justice. It was the complete abandonment of justice in favor of royal convenience. It was proof that when absolute power decides it wants something, concepts like truth and law and basic human decency become optional suggestions rather than binding principles. Anne Boleyn had been convicted of being inconvenient to Henry VIII. In Tudor England, that was apparently a capital offence. Here's a detail that perfectly captures Henry VIII's twisted psychology. He imported Anne Boleyn's executioner from France, not because English executioners weren't available, but because Henry wanted Anne's death to be carried out with the kind of sophisticated efficiency that he associated with continental professionalism. Think about this for a moment. Henry was about to execute the woman he'd moved heaven and earth to marry, and his primary concern was ensuring that her beheading would be performed with appropriate style and technical competence. It's like hiring a 5-star chef to prepare your final meal while you're planning to poison your dinner guest. The executioner Henry selected was known as the Swordsman of Calais, a specialist who used a sword rather than the traditional English axe. This wasn't just about technical precision, it was about sending a message. Sword executions were considered more dignified than axe executions, typically reserved for royalty and high nobility. Henry was essentially saying, "I'm going to murder my wife, but I want everyone to know that I'm doing it with class." Anne spent her final days in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she'd stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. The irony must have been devastating. She was imprisoned in apartments that had been refurbished for her pre-coronation celebration, surrounded by decorations that commemorated her elevation to queenship. But Anne's behavior during her final imprisonment reveals the full scope of her remarkable character. Instead of collapsing into despair or raging against the injustice of her situation, she used her last days to demonstrate the dignity and intelligence that had made her worthy of a crown in the first place. Anne asked for communion daily and spent hours in prayer, but these weren't the desperate religious observances of someone trying to bargain with God for miraculous rescue. Anne's faith during her final days was calm and genuine, suggesting that she'd found peace with whatever divine justice waited beyond her earthly execution. She also continued to maintain her innocence, but without the frantic protests of someone hoping to change minds that were already made up. Anne knew that her execution was a political necessity for Henry, not a legal consequence of actual crimes. She understood that truth was irrelevant to her situation, which freed her to focus on maintaining her own integrity rather than fighting a battle she'd already lost. Most remarkably, Anne used her final days to protect other people who might suffer because of their association with her. She wrote letters asking that her servants be taken care of, that her debts be paid from her own property rather than becoming burdens for her family, and that the men who'd been executed alongside her be remembered as innocent victims rather than guilty accomplices. Anne Boleyn was facing her own imminent death with more grace and practical consideration for others than Henry VIII had shown during 6 years of getting everything he'd wanted. On May 17, 1536, Anne's marriage to Henry was officially annulled, making her daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. This legal maneuver was almost comically unnecessary. Henry was planning to execute Anne the next day anyway, but it reveals his compulsive need to erase not just Anne's life, but her entire relationship with him. Henry wasn't content to kill his wife. He wanted to retroactively eliminate her from royal history. Anne wasn't just going to die, she was going to be legally erased, as if their marriage had never happened, and their daughter had never been legitimate. The night before her execution, Anne reportedly said to her guard, I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." She then laughed and put her hands around her throat, demonstrating a dark sense of humor that remained intact even in the face of imminent death. This wasn't hysteria or breakdown. This was Anne Boleyn finding genuine amusement in the absurdity of her situation. She was about to be killed for crimes everyone knew she hadn't committed, by a husband who'd restructured English Christianity to marry her, using an imported French executioner who specialized in dignified royal beheadings. If you can't laugh at that level of surreal political theatre, you probably shouldn't be Queen of England in the first place. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne was led to a scaffold that had been constructed specifically for her execution. Unlike public executions which were typically held on Tower Hill, where crowds could gather, Anne's beheading was conducted within the Tower grounds before a small audience of courtiers and officials. Henry had decided that Anne's death should be witnessed but not celebrated, official but not spectacular. He wanted her eliminated efficiently, rather than transformed into a public martyr. Anne's final speech was brief and carefully crafted. She didn't proclaim her innocence. That would have been seen as criticizing the king's justice. She didn't express anger or bitterness. That would have been considered inappropriate for a woman facing death. Instead, she said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die." This was Anne Boleyn's masterpiece of political rhetoric, a statement that accepted her execution while subtly highlighting its injustice, that showed respect for royal authority while making clear that she was dying for political rather than legal reasons. She ended by asking prayers for the king, and declaring that she committed her soul to God. Then she knelt, and the swordsman of Calais performed his imported expertise with the kind of professional competence that Henry had specifically requested. Anne Boleyn was dead. Long live Jane Seymour, who would marry Henry 11 days later and discover that being the king's third wife came with exactly the same impossible expectations as being his second wife. Some lessons, apparently, can only be learned through repetition. Here's the thing about executing your wife for fabricated crimes. It tends to have consequences that extend beyond simply solving your immediate marital dissatisfaction. Henry VIII thought he was closing the book on Anne Boleyn when that French sword separated her head from her shoulders, but he was actually opening a much larger and more complicated chapter in English history. The immediate aftermath was exactly what Henry had planned. Jane Seymour became his third queen 11 days after Anne's execution, which is roughly the same amount of time most people take between breaking up with someone and changing their relationship status on social media. Henry had efficiently eliminated his romantic problem and installed a replacement wife who seemed unlikely to cause similar difficulties. But let's talk about what Henry hadn't planned for, starting with his daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth was now officially illegitimate, legally erased from the royal succession, along with her mother's marriage. Henry had declared that his daughter with Anne Boleyn was a bastard who had no claim to the throne, which should have been the end of Elizabeth's political relevance, except Henry kept forgetting to actually treat Elizabeth like she was illegitimate. She remained at court, received an excellent education, and was generally treated like a princess, despite being legally classified as a former princess. Henry seemed unable to decide whether Elizabeth was his daughter or just some random child who happened to live in his palaces and call him father. This confusion about Elizabeth's status would eventually have consequences that Henry couldn't possibly have anticipated. The little girl whose legitimacy he'd casually destroyed to justify executing her mother would eventually become Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs, and the ruler who would define what it meant to be English for generations to come. But the immediate political consequences of Anne's execution were almost as dramatic as the long-term ones. European observers were absolutely horrified by what Henry had done. Executing a queen for adultery was one thing. Several European monarchs had done that when faced with genuinely unfaithful wives. But executing a queen on obviously fabricated charges, after a trial that made show trials look sophisticated, was something else. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, wrote to his ambassador, "The King of England has committed such an enormity that I am ashamed to write of it." The French court, which wasn't exactly known for its moral squeamishness, was shocked by the casual brutality of Anne's execution. Even the Pope, who had no reason to love Anne Boleyn, expressed horror at Henry's actions. Henry had intended Anne's execution to demonstrate his decisive leadership and his commitment to moral purity. Instead, he demonstrated that the King of England would murder anyone who inconvenienced him, regardless of guilt or innocence, and that English justice was whatever Henry happened to want on any given day. This damaged Henry's international reputation in ways that would plague him for the rest of his reign. European powers began treating England like a rogue state ruled by an unpredictable tyrant, rather than a legitimate monarchy governed by law and Christian principles. But the domestic consequences were even more significant. Anne's execution sent a clear message to Henry's subjects. Nobody was safe from the king's displeasure, regardless of their rank, their service to the crown, or their actual guilt or innocence. The English nobility, who had watched 26 of their peers convict Anne Boleyn on charges they all knew were false, suddenly realized that their own positions depended entirely on maintaining Henry's good favor. Legal protections, constitutional traditions, and even basic concepts of justice were irrelevant if the king decided you were a problem that needed solving. This created a political climate of fear and servility that would poison Henry's court for the rest of his reign. Nobles stopped offering honest counsel because honesty might be interpreted as criticism. Advisors started telling Henry what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The kind of independent thinking and frank discussion that effective governance requires became too dangerous to practice openly. Henry had gained the short-term satisfaction of disposing of an inconvenient wife, but he'd lost the long-term benefit of having advisors who were willing to tell him when he was making mistakes. And speaking of mistakes, let's talk about Jane Seymour's reign as Henry's third queen. Jane had observed Anne's career carefully and learned all the wrong lessons from it. She'd concluded that Anne's problem was being too intelligent, too independent, and too willing to express opinions about politics and religion. So Jane made herself the opposite: agreeable, submissive, and apparently content to have no thoughts beyond whatever Henry wanted her to think. This strategy worked brilliantly for about 18 months, during which Henry was delighted to have a wife who never challenged him, never disagreed with him, and never made him feel like he needed to justify his decisions to anyone. Jane gave Henry the male heir he'd been desperately seeking, the future Edward VI, born in October 1537. Finally, Henry had his precious son, the boy who would justify all his marriages, divorces, executions, and religious revolutions. Jane died 12 days after giving birth, probably from puerperal sepsis, which was a common and frequently fatal complication of childbirth in the 16th century. Henry was devastated by Jane's death in ways that revealed the shallow foundations of his affection for his wives. He mourned Jane as the perfect woman who'd given him everything he'd wanted, and then died before she could disappoint him or become inconvenient. Jane became Henry's ideal wife, precisely because she'd died before their relationship could develop the complexities that had destroyed his marriages to Catherine and Anne. In other words, Henry's perfect wife was a dead wife who'd produced a male heir before expiring. This set a standard that his subsequent 3 wives would find somewhat difficult to meet. The Anne Boleyn execution had solved Henry's immediate problem, but created a template for solving future romantic difficulties that would make his remaining years increasingly bloody and increasingly lonely. Let's talk about the ultimate irony of Anne Boleyn's story. The daughter Henry declared illegitimate to justify executing her mother eventually became the ruler who proved that Anne had been right about almost everything. Elizabeth Tudor grew up in the shadow of her mother's execution, officially a bastard princess, but practically treated like royalty in the kind of confusing legal grey area that Henry VIII specialized in creating. She received an extraordinary education, partly because Henry couldn't quite bring himself to treat his daughter like a commoner, and partly because brilliant educators like Roger Ascham recognized her exceptional intelligence and couldn't resist the challenge of teaching a mind that's sharp. But Elizabeth also grew up knowing that her mother had been executed for allegedly betraying her father, and that her own legitimacy depended on accepting that this execution had been justified. She had to navigate the psychological minefield of honoring a father who'd murdered her mother, while maintaining her own claim to eventually inherit his throne. This would have broken most people. Elizabeth turned it into a superpower. By the time Elizabeth became queen in 1558, 22 years after Anne's execution, she'd learned lessons about power, survival, and the dangers of romantic entanglement that would shape her into one of history's most successful monarchs. Elizabeth's approach to queenship was essentially Anne Boleyn's political philosophy perfected through decades of careful observation and strategic thinking. Where Anne had tried to balance independence with marriage, Elizabeth chose independence over marriage entirely. Where Anne had attempted to influence Henry through partnership, Elizabeth wielded power directly without needing to work through a husband. Most importantly, Elizabeth understood something that Anne had learned too late. Men who break kingdoms apart to possess you are men who will break you apart when possession becomes boring. Elizabeth I never married, despite decades of international pressure and countless suitors who offered everything from romantic devotion to military alliances to vast financial settlements. She turned courtship into statecraft, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, while never actually surrendering the independence that marriage would have required. When asked why she remained single, Elizabeth gave various diplomatic answers over the years, but the truth was probably simpler. She'd seen what happened to women who trusted their happiness and security to men who viewed wives as political accessories rather than human partners. Elizabeth's religious policies also vindicated Anne Boleyn's Protestant convictions, but with a sophistication that Anne hadn't lived long enough to develop. The Elizabethan religious settlement established a form of English Protestantism that was theologically reformed but politically moderate. Exactly the kind of religious compromise that Anne had envisioned, but hadn't had time to implement. Elizabeth proved that Protestant reform could coexist with political stability, that breaking from Rome didn't have to mean constant religious warfare, and that English Christianity could be both genuinely reformed and genuinely English. She accomplished everything that Anne's Protestant sympathies had aimed for, but with the kind of careful long-term planning that Anne had never been allowed to pursue. But perhaps Elizabeth's greatest vindication of her mother was her approach to marriage negotiations. Elizabeth turned the European marriage market into her personal chess game, keeping potential suitors interested for decades while never actually committing to anyone. She flirted with Philip II of Spain, who had been married to her half-sister Mary. She conducted an elaborate courtship with Eric XIV of Sweden. She famously dallied with Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and great love, while never allowing romance to override political calculation. She even entertained marriage proposals from French princes, who were young enough to be her sons. Each of these courtships gave Elizabeth diplomatic leverage, international prestige, and domestic excitement, while costing her nothing more than time and emotional energy. She'd learned to use men's desire for her as a political resource rather than allowing it to become a personal vulnerability. Elizabeth was essentially playing Anne Boleyn's original strategy, using romantic unavailability to maintain power, but as a queen regnant rather than a potential queen consort. She had the authority to set her own terms rather than having to negotiate for someone else's approval. The results speak for themselves. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years, and established England as a major European power. Her court became a centre of learning, arts and culture that attracted talent from across the continent. Her naval policies led to the defeat of the Spanish Armada and established England as a formidable maritime force. Under Elizabeth, England experienced the kind of political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flowering that Henry VIII had always claimed he was working toward but had never actually achieved. Elizabeth had accomplished everything Henry had wanted. She'd secured the Tudor succession, established England's international prestige, created religious unity without religious warfare, and built a court that was both intellectually sophisticated and politically effective. And she'd done it all while remaining unmarried, which proved that the desperate need for male heirs that had justified Henry's 6 marriages, multiple executions, and religious revolution had been based on a fundamentally flawed premise. England didn't need a king. It just needed a competent ruler. Elizabeth happened to be female, but her gender was irrelevant to her effectiveness as a monarch. The daughter Henry had declared illegitimate to justify executing her mother, had become living proof that Anne Boleyn's intelligence, independence and Protestant convictions were exactly what England needed. Elizabeth I was Anne Boleyn's ultimate revenge on the system that had destroyed her, and the ultimate vindication of everything Anne had represented. Henry VIII had killed Anne Boleyn because she'd refused to be the submissive, decorative queen he thought he wanted. Elizabeth I became the brilliant independent queen that England actually needed. Sometimes the best revenge is living well. Sometimes it's ruling well for half a century while proving that your mother was right about everything. Here's where Anne Boleyn's story gets really interesting. What happened to her reputation after she died? Because the woman who was executed as a treacherous adulteress somehow transformed into a romantic heroine, feminist icon, and tragic victim of patriarchal oppression, depending on who was telling the story and what they wanted it to prove. The mythology of Anne Boleyn began almost immediately after her death, and it was shaped by people who had their own political and religious agendas, rather than any interest in historical accuracy. Protestant propagandists turned Anne into a martyr for religious reform, emphasizing her support for Bible translation and her patronage of reformist scholars, while conveniently ignoring the fact that she'd been executed for adultery rather than heresy. In their version, Anne was a saintly woman who died because she'd challenged Catholic corruption. Catholic polemicists painted Anne as a scheming seductress who'd corrupted an innocent king and led England into religious error. In their telling, her execution was divine justice for the chaos she'd brought to Christendom, and Henry's subsequent marital troubles were God's punishment for abandoning his lawful wife Catherine. Both versions were more concerned with scoring theological points than with understanding who Anne Boleyn had actually been or what had actually happened to her. The romantic mythology really took off in the 19th century, when Victorian writers discovered that Anne's story had all the elements of perfect melodrama: forbidden love, royal intrigue, innocent suffering, and tragic death. Novels, plays, and popular histories transformed Anne from a complex political figure into a love-struck victim whose only crime was capturing a king's heart. This version was complete nonsense, but it was emotionally satisfying nonsense that allowed readers to feel superior to the brutal Tudors, while enjoying vicarious romance with royalty. Victorian Anne was pure, passionate, and ultimately powerless, exactly the kind of tragic heroine that 19th century audiences found irresistible. The feminist mythology emerged in the 20th century, as women's rights advocates discovered that Anne could be recast as an early example of female ambition destroyed by male insecurity. In this version, Anne was a brilliant woman who'd threatened Henry's masculinity by being smarter and more capable than he was comfortable with. This interpretation had more historical validity than the Victorian romance version, but it still reduced Anne's complex political and religious motivations to simple gender dynamics. Each generation has essentially created its own Anne Boleyn, using her story to explore whatever issues seemed most relevant to their particular historical moment. She's been a Protestant martyr, a Catholic villain, a romantic heroine, a feminist icon, a victim of domestic violence, and a calculating social climber, sometimes all simultaneously. But here's what's fascinating about this mythological evolution. None of these versions captures the most remarkable thing about the real Anne Boleyn, which was her refusal to accept that she had to choose between intelligence and femininity, between independence and marriage, between personal happiness and political effectiveness. The real Anne Boleyn was trying to create a new model of queenship that would allow her to be intellectually engaged, politically influential, and romantically fulfilled simultaneously. She believed she could be Henry's partner rather than just his possession, his advisor rather than just his decoration, his equal rather than just his subordinate. This was an incredibly radical idea in the 16th century, so radical that most historians have struggled to take it seriously. It was easier to cast Anne as either a victim or a villain than to acknowledge that she might have been attempting something genuinely revolutionary. Anne's tragedy wasn't that she was too smart or too ambitious or too independent for her time. Her tragedy was that she was trying to negotiate with a man who was fundamentally incapable of seeing women as anything other than extensions of his own ego. The mythological versions of Anne Boleyn miss this, because they assume that her story is fundamentally about romance, religion, or gender politics. But Anne's story is actually about power, who gets to wield it, how it's maintained, and what happens when someone challenges the assumptions that keep it in place. Anne understood that queenship could be more than ceremonial, if the queen was smart enough and strategic enough to make it substantive. She saw that religious reform offered opportunities for female influence that traditional Catholicism didn't provide. She recognized that education and cultural sophistication could be forms of power that didn't depend on male approval. But she underestimated the psychological fragility of the man she was trying to train as her partner. Henry VIII wasn't just resistant to sharing power with a woman. He was constitutionally incapable of viewing women as anything other than reflections of his own magnificence. Anne's attempt to create a partnership with Henry was doomed not because she was inadequate, but because Henry was fundamentally unfit for the kind of relationship she was trying to build. The various mythologies that have grown up around Anne Boleyn obscure this reality because they assume that her story must be either romantically tragic or politically inspirational. But Anne's story is actually much more complex and much more disturbing than either of those frameworks allows. Anne Boleyn was a brilliant woman who tried to revolutionize the most traditional institution in England, marriage to the king, and was destroyed not by her failures, but by her successes. She proved that queens could be intellectually formidable, politically sophisticated, and personally independent. Henry VIII executed her precisely because she'd been too successful at becoming the kind of queen she wanted to be rather than the kind of queen he'd expected her to become. That's not a romantic tragedy or a feminist parable. That's a story about what happens when genuine innovation meets institutional resistance backed by absolute power. The mythology machine has turned Anne Boleyn into whatever each generation needs her to be. But the real Anne Boleyn was something much more interesting, a woman who saw possibilities that nobody else imagined and paid the ultimate price for trying to make them real. So what can we learn from Anne Boleyn's story? Well, that's a complicated question, because the lessons depend entirely on which version of her story you believe. And frankly, most of the lessons people have drawn from her life are spectacularly wrong. Let's start with the lesson that Henry VIII should have learned but didn't. Executing people for inconveniencing you doesn't actually solve your problems. It just creates new problems, while eliminating the people who might have helped you solve the original ones. Henry's post-Anne marriage career reads like a masterclass in not learning from experience. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, lasted 6 months before Henry decided she was too ugly and too foreign for his refined tastes. He divorced her, but at least he let her live, possibly because she was smart enough to agree immediately to whatever he wanted, rather than forcing him to invent elaborate legal justifications for getting rid of her. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, was basically Anne Boleyn, without the intelligence, education or political sophistication that had made Anne genuinely formidable. Catherine was young, pretty, and sexually inexperienced. Exactly the kind of wife Henry thought he wanted after dealing with Anne's complexity. Catherine Howard lasted less than 2 years before Henry had her executed. Also for adultery. The charges against Catherine were probably more credible than those against Anne, but the speed with which Henry moved from infatuation to execution suggests that he'd learned to streamline his wife disposal process, rather than to question whether his expectations for marriage might be fundamentally unrealistic. Wife number 6, Catherine Parr, survived only because Henry died before he got bored with her. She was reportedly making plans to flee the country when Henry's health finally failed, which tells you everything you need to know about what it was like to be married to the King of England by the end of his reign. Henry's inability to learn from the Anne Boleyn debacle reveals something important about power and psychology. When you're never held accountable for your mistakes, you never develop the capacity for self-reflection that would help you avoid repeating them. Henry VIII lived his entire adult life in an environment where everyone told him his failures were someone else's fault. His lack of male heirs was Catherine's fault for not producing sons, then Anne's fault for not producing sons, then God's fault for not blessing his marriage. His international isolation was the Pope's fault for being unreasonable about divorce, then European powers' fault for not recognizing his religious authority. Henry never had to consider that maybe his problems stemmed from his own psychological limitations, rather than from external obstacles that could be eliminated through sufficient violence. But the lesson modern readers usually draw from Anne Boleyn's story is equally problematic. We tend to see her as a feminist icon who was destroyed by patriarchal oppression, which allows us to feel superior to Tudor brutality, while missing the ways that power still operates through personal relationships in our own time. Anne Boleyn's story isn't a simple case of female ambition being destroyed by male insecurity. It's a complex story about what happens when someone tries to negotiate with power from a position of fundamental vulnerability. Anne thought she could manage Henry through intelligence, charm, and strategic withholding of sexual access. This wasn't a foolish strategy. It had worked brilliantly for years and had gotten her everything she'd initially wanted. But Anne's strategy assumed that Henry was rational enough to recognize his own long-term interests, and psychologically stable enough to maintain consistent relationships with people he claimed to love. Both assumptions turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The real lesson of Anne Boleyn's story might be this: be very careful whose obsession you become, because people who will destroy everything to possess you are also people who will destroy you when possession becomes boring. This lesson applies far beyond 16th century royal marriages. Contemporary relationships still feature people who mistake intensity for love, who confuse control with commitment, and who believe that dramatic gestures prove romantic devotion rather than psychological instability. Anne Boleyn's story is relevant not because we still live under absolute monarchy, but because we still live with people whose sense of self-worth depends on controlling others, whose love is conditional on getting what they want when they want it, and whose romantic obsessions are really about power rather than partnership. But here's an even more uncomfortable lesson. Anne Boleyn succeeded brilliantly at achieving her goals, and her success was precisely what destroyed her. She wanted to be queen, and she became queen. She wanted to be valued for her intelligence, and Henry initially treasured her intellectual companionship. She wanted to advance Protestant reform, and she successfully influenced English religious policy. Anne got everything she asked for, and getting it put her in a position where someone else controlled whether she could keep it. This is the most disturbing aspect of her story. Anne wasn't destroyed by failure, but by success that came with terms and conditions she hadn't fully understood. Modern readers want to believe that Anne's story is about female empowerment being crushed by patriarchal oppression, because that narrative allows us to identify with her as a victim of systems we've presumably overcome. But Anne Boleyn's story is actually about the dangers of achieving everything you think you want when the person giving it to you has the power to take it all away whenever they choose. That's not a problem that's been solved by feminism, democracy, or any other social progress we've made since the 16th century. It's still the fundamental dynamic between people who have power and people who want something from them. Anne Boleyn's real lesson isn't that women should be more careful around powerful men, or that men should be less possessive of accomplished women. Her real lesson is that no relationship can survive when one person has absolute power over the other, regardless of how much they claim to love each other, or how genuinely they initially care about each other's happiness. That's as true now as it was in... Here we are at the end of Anne Boleyn's story. But of course it's not really the end, because Anne Boleyn never actually went away. She became a ghost that haunted English history for centuries, appearing whenever someone needed to make a point about power, love, religion, or the dangers of ambition. But let's talk about what Anne Boleyn actually accomplished, because the list is remarkable for someone who was queen for less than 3 years and died before her 36th birthday. Anne fundamentally altered the relationship between the English monarchy and marriage. Before Anne, royal marriage was a straightforward political transaction. Kings married for diplomatic alliances and succession planning, while seeking emotional and sexual fulfillment elsewhere. Anne forced Henry to treat marriage as both a political institution and a personal relationship, which created expectations and complications that would plague English royalty for generations. She established the precedent that queens could be intellectually and politically engaged, rather than merely decorative. Even though Anne's independence ultimately contributed to her downfall, she proved that female intelligence was compatible with royal authority. Every subsequent English queen, from Elizabeth I to the present day, has benefited from Anne's expansion of what queenship could include. Anne's influence on English religious reform was profound and lasting. She didn't just support Protestant theology, she helped shape a distinctively English form of Protestantism that balanced Reformed doctrine with political pragmatism. The Church of England that emerged from Henry's break with Rome bore Anne's intellectual fingerprints in ways that most historians have underappreciated. Most importantly, Anne Boleyn proved that it was possible to challenge royal authority and survive, at least temporarily. She spent 6 years refusing to accept Henry's initial terms for their relationship, and she succeeded in forcing him to completely restructure his offers. Even though she ultimately paid the ultimate price for this success, she demonstrated that royal power wasn't as absolute as it appeared. But Anne's most significant accomplishment was probably unintentional. She forced Henry VIII to reveal the true nature of his character, and in doing so, she changed how power operated in England. Before Anne, Henry had been able to maintain the fiction that he was a benevolent monarch, who only used violence when absolutely necessary for the good of his kingdom. Anne's execution destroyed that fiction permanently. Henry had murdered a woman who was obviously innocent of the charges against her, and he'd done it for reasons that were obviously personal rather than political. After Anne's execution, everyone understood that Henry VIII would kill anyone who inconvenienced him, regardless of their guilt, their service to the crown, or their relationship to him. This knowledge changed how everyone interacted with royal power. The English nobility became more servile, but also more calculating. They learned to tell Henry what he wanted to hear, while secretly planning for the possibility that he might eventually decide they were problems that needed eliminating. Parliament became more compliant but also more strategic about when to resist royal demands. They'd seen what happened to people who opposed Henry directly, but they also understood that complete capitulation to royal whims was dangerous for English political stability. The English people learned to love their monarchs more carefully, understanding that royal favour was temporary and that today's beloved queen could become tomorrow's executed traitor if political circumstances shifted. Anne Boleyn's execution created the psychological foundation for the English Civil War that would occur a century later. The English had learned that their kings were not divinely appointed protectors, but rather dangerous individuals whose power needed to be limited by law rather than trusted to personal virtue. But let's also acknowledge what Anne Boleyn failed to accomplish, because her failures are as instructive as her successes. Anne never found a way to make her intelligence and independence assets rather than liabilities in her relationship with Henry. She couldn't transform Henry from a possessive husband into a genuine partner, despite years of effort and considerable tactical skill. She never developed a sustainable strategy for maintaining royal favour while preserving her own integrity. Anne's approach to managing Henry was brilliant in the short term, but catastrophic in the long term, because it was based on psychological insights about someone who turned out to be fundamentally unpredictable. Most tragically, Anne never found a way to protect herself from the consequences of her own success. She achieved everything she'd wanted and then discovered that achievement had put her in a position of complete vulnerability to someone who'd proven himself willing to destroy anything that disappointed him. These failures weren't personal inadequacies. They were the inevitable result of trying to negotiate with absolute power from a position of fundamental weakness. Anne's intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking were remarkable, but they weren't sufficient to overcome the structural impossibilities of her situation. Which brings us to the final, most uncomfortable lesson of Anne Boleyn's story. Sometimes there are no good choices available, and intelligence, virtue, and determination aren't enough to create options that don't exist. Anne Boleyn did everything right, according to the best information available to her, and she was still destroyed by forces beyond her control or prediction. Her story isn't a morality tale about the dangers of ambition or the rewards of virtue. It's a tragedy about what happens when individual excellence meets institutional brutality. But here's why Anne Boleyn's story still matters. She proved that it was possible to imagine different ways of being human, even in circumstances that seemed to allow no alternatives. She expanded the realm of possibility for women, for queens, for English Protestants, and for anyone who wanted to believe that intelligence and courage could triumph over tradition and oppression. Anne Boleyn didn't succeed in creating the world she wanted, but she proved that such a world was conceivable. She died for trying to be something that had never existed before. A queen who was also a person, a wife who was also a partner, a woman who refused to accept that femininity and intelligence were incompatible. 500 years later, we're still trying to finish what Anne Boleyn started, which means her story isn't really over yet. Let that sink in for a moment. We've just spent 16 chapters exploring the life and death of a woman who lived less than 36 years, reigned as queen for less than 3, and has been dead for nearly 5 centuries. And yet Anne Boleyn's story still feels urgently relevant, still sparks passionate debates, still forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, ambition, and the price of challenging systems that seem unchangeable. That's not because Anne Boleyn was perfect. She wasn't. It's not because her story has a happy ending. It definitely doesn't. It's because Anne Boleyn represents something that transcends her particular historical moment, the possibility of refusing to accept the world as you find it, even when that refusal might cost you everything. Think about what Anne actually did, stripped of all the romantic mythology and political propaganda that has accumulated around her story over the centuries. She looked at the most powerful man in England and said, essentially, "Your current offer is insufficient. Please revise your terms and try again." This wasn't youthful naivety or romantic delusion. Anne Boleyn was a sophisticated woman who understood exactly how dangerous Henry VIII could be. She'd watched him destroy Cardinal Wolsey, execute the Duke of Buckingham, and systematically eliminate anyone who inconvenienced him. She knew what happened to people who told Henry no. And she told him no anyway. Not once, but repeatedly. For 6 years, until he finally restructured English Christianity to meet her requirements. Anne Boleyn looked at a system designed to give her no choices except submission or destruction. And she created a third option that nobody had imagined before. She turned romantic negotiation into political revolution, personal standards into religious reform, and individual autonomy into institutional change. The fact that she ultimately paid the ultimate price for this audacity doesn't diminish the accomplishment. It proves how revolutionary it actually was. But let's be honest about what Anne Boleyn's story reveals about the nature of progress itself. Change doesn't happen because reasonable people make reasonable requests to reasonable authorities who respond with reasonable reforms. Change happens because unreasonable people make unreasonable demands that force systems to adapt or reveal their true brutality. Anne Boleyn's unreasonable refusal to accept Henry's initial terms ultimately produced the English Reformation, the translation of the Bible into English, the precedent for parliamentary oversight of royal marriages, and the psychological foundation for constitutional monarchy. Her personal romantic standards accidentally catalyzed changes that would benefit millions of people she never met. This is how transformation actually works. Individuals make choices based on their own values and circumstances, and those choices create ripple effects that extend far beyond anything they intended or could have predicted. Anne Boleyn wasn't trying to advance women's rights, establish religious freedom, or limit royal power. She was trying to create a marriage that would satisfy her intellectual, emotional, and spiritual needs. But achieving that personal goal required challenging assumptions about queenship, royal authority, and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional power. Her personal revolution became everyone else's social progress, whether they wanted it or not. But here's what makes Anne Boleyn's story both inspiring and terrifying. She succeeded completely at everything she set out to accomplish, and her complete success was exactly what killed her. Anne wanted to be valued for her intelligence. Henry treasured her intellectual companionship until it made him feel intellectually inadequate. She wanted to influence religious policy. She successfully shaped Protestant reform until Henry decided her independence, threatened his authority. She wanted to be queen. She achieved the crown, and then discovered that queens who exceeded expectations became threats to kings who hadn't. Anne Boleyn's tragedy wasn't that she failed, but that she succeeded beyond everyone's capacity to handle her success, including her own. This is the most uncomfortable lesson embedded in her story. Sometimes getting everything you want puts you in more danger than wanting things you can't have. Sometimes success is more dangerous than failure, because failure leaves you invisible, while success makes you a target. Anne Boleyn transformed herself from a minor courtier into the Queen of England, and that transformation made her powerful enough to threaten the king who had elevated her. She became too valuable to ignore and too independent to control, which is a combination that absolute monarchs find unacceptable. But here's why Anne Boleyn's story ultimately transcends tragedy. She proved that transformation is possible even when it's dangerous, that individuals can reshape institutions even when those institutions destroy them for trying, and that the courage to demand better treatment can create better possibilities for future generations, even when it doesn't create better outcomes for the people doing the demanding. Elizabeth I inherited Anne Boleyn's intelligence, independence, and religious convictions, but she also inherited a world that Anne's choices had made slightly more receptive to female authority. Elizabeth could be the virgin queen who never married because Anne had proven that marriage to kings came with unacceptable costs. Every subsequent Queen of England has ruled in a world that Anne Boleyn's refusal to be merely decorative had helped create. Every English woman who has demanded education, autonomy, or respect has benefited from Anne's expansion of what feminine ambition could include. Every person who has ever refused to accept that their circumstances were permanent has channeled some echo of Anne Boleyn's audacious conviction that individual standards could reshape institutional realities. Anne Boleyn didn't just break the world apart to get what she wanted. She broke it apart to prove that it could be broken, that systems that seemed permanent were actually fragile, and that individuals who seemed powerless could actually reshape the foundations of how power operated. She died for proving that change was possible. But she also lived long enough to prove that change was inevitable. That's not a bad legacy for someone who started as a nobody and ended as the woman who accidentally created the modern world. So here we are, nearly 500 years after Anne Boleyn lost her head, and we're still talking about her, still arguing about her, still trying to figure out whether she was a victim or a villain, a feminist icon or a cautionary tale, a romantic heroine or a political revolutionary. The fact that we can't decide what Anne Boleyn represents might be the most important thing about her legacy. She refuses to fit into the neat categories that make historical figures comfortable and safe. Every time someone tries to reduce her to a simple moral lesson, Anne Boleyn escapes and becomes something more complicated. Maybe that's because Anne Boleyn's story isn't actually about the 16th century at all. Maybe it's about something much more contemporary and much more personal. What happens when you refuse to accept the limitations that other people want to place on your life? Anne Boleyn looked at a world that told her she could be decorative, or invisible, submissive, or destroyed, and she said, "I'd like to propose a third option that nobody has tried yet." The world responded by giving her everything she asked for, and then killing her for asking. That dynamic, achieving everything you want, only to discover that success makes you a target, feels remarkably contemporary. We live in a time when individual achievement is celebrated right up until it becomes threatening to people who assumed they would always be more successful than you. Anne Boleyn's story resonates because she represents everyone who has ever been punished for exceeding expectations, who has ever been destroyed for being too good at things other people thought they owned, who has ever discovered that getting what you want can be more dangerous than wanting things you can't have. But Anne's story also resonates because she represents the possibility of transformation that transcends individual success or failure. She proved that one person's refusal to accept the status quo can create changes that outlast their lifetime, their reputation, and even their intention. The English Reformation, the precedent for parliamentary oversight of royal marriages, the expansion of educational opportunities for women, the translation of religious texts into vernacular languages, all of these developments can be traced back to Anne Boleyn's personal decision to hold out for a better offer from Henry VIII. Anne wasn't trying to change the world. She was trying to create the specific life she wanted for herself. But creating that life required challenging assumptions and institutions that had seemed permanent. And those challenges created opportunities for change that extended far beyond Anne's personal circumstances. This is how progress actually works most of the time. Not through grand political movements or revolutionary manifestos, but through individuals who insist on being treated with the respect and dignity they believe they deserve, regardless of whether existing systems are designed to provide it. Anne Boleyn's insistence on being valued for her intelligence forced Henry VIII to acknowledge that queens could be intellectual partners rather than just ceremonial accessories. Her religious convictions helped shape a form of English Protestantism that balanced Reformed theology with political pragmatism. Her refusal to be sexually available without marriage forced Henry to choose between his desires and his principles. And when he chose his desires, he had to restructure English Christianity to justify that choice. Every personal standard Anne maintained became a precedent that expanded possibilities for future generations of women, Protestants, and anyone else who wanted to believe that individual conscience could triumph over institutional pressure. But let's not romanticize what Anne accomplished or ignore what it cost her. Anne Boleyn paid the ultimate price for her refusal to be what other people expected her to be. She died young, violently, and unjustly, separated from her daughter, and remembered by many of her contemporaries as a dangerous seductress who had corrupted their king. Anne's story is inspiring, but it's also a warning. The world is often more willing to destroy people who challenge its assumptions than to change those assumptions to accommodate new possibilities. This tension between individual transformation and institutional resistance hasn't been resolved in the 5 centuries since Anne's death. We still live in a world where people who exceed expectations often become targets, where success can be more dangerous than failure, and where the courage to demand better treatment sometimes results in worse consequences than accepting inadequate treatment would have produced. Anne Boleyn's story matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of progress and the relationship between individual courage and social change. She succeeded brilliantly at everything she attempted, and her brilliant success was exactly what destroyed her. That's not a comforting moral lesson. It's not a reassuring narrative about virtue being rewarded or justice eventually prevailing. It's a complex story about what happens when individual excellence meets institutional brutality, and how progress sometimes requires sacrifices that seem too high to justify the changes they produce. But Anne Boleyn's story also suggests that the value of challenging unjust systems might not be measured by whether the challengers survive or thrive. Maybe the value lies in proving that such systems can be challenged at all, in expanding the realm of possibility for future generations. and in forcing institutions to reveal their true nature when they're confronted with people they can't control or co-opt. Anne Boleyn broke the world apart to create something better, and then the world broke her apart for trying. But the something better survived, even though she didn't. 500 years later, we're still living in the world that Anne Boleyn's choices helped create. We're still benefiting from precedents she established, institutions she influenced, and possibilities she proved were achievable. We're also still grappling with the same fundamental questions her story raises. How much are you willing to risk to become who you want to be? What happens when getting everything you think you want puts you in danger you didn't anticipate? How do you navigate the gap between individual transformation and institutional resistance? Anne Boleyn didn't answer these questions definitively, but she proved they were worth asking. Even when asking might cost you everything. That's why her story isn't really finished yet. As long as people are still struggling to become themselves in worlds that prefer them to remain who they've always been, Anne Boleyn's ghost will keep appearing to remind us that transformation is possible, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. So there you have it. The woman who seduced a king broke Christianity in half, and changed history just by refusing to settle for less than she deserved. Still here? You know what comes next. Subscribe, because apparently some stories are too dangerous to forget.